introduce my husband, U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders, U.S. Representative Pramila Jayapal, and U.S. Representative Ro Khanna. And they are all amazing progressives. And hopefully they'll come in a minute. They said they were ready. Okay. Show them where to.
Hey, everybody. You disappear into these chairs.
Think about what it's like for me.
In fact, we can't see you at all. You have disappeared.
I don't have to sit up like this.
All right, I am honored to be here with two very good friends and two of the leading members of the U.S. House of Representatives. You all know Pramila Jayapal does a great job as chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And Ro Khanna was running around the country. I thought it was time that he saw the rest of America, so he became a co-chair of my presidential campaign, and we sent him all over America and learned about New England and all kinds of places. And Ro's doing a great job in the House as well. Let me start off by saying a few words, and I'm going to give it over to Pramila and Ro. Start off with my own personal experience. I think I mentioned this yesterday to those of you who were here. I grew up in a working class family in Brooklyn, New York, and my entire life as a kid was lived in a rent-controlled, 3.5-room rent-controlled apartment. And my father never made much money, but the rent we paid was $75 a month. And it turned out that that was, doing a little bit of arithmetic, my father made $125 a week as a paint salesman, paying 15% of our family income for housing. How's that? And we took it for granted. It was no big deal. We were not unique. We lived in a rent-controlled apartment, rent-controlled significantly, not all, rent-controlled neighborhood, and that was the way it was. And you know, I think back, and we didn't have much money. And if we were forced to pay 50% to 40% of our income in housing, it really, really would have made life a lot more difficult for a family where economics was already difficult. So that's kind of my first brush-in with housing, in a sense, and rent control, as it happens. Then I was elected mayor of the city of Burlington, Vermont in 1981. And like many communities, we had a serious housing problem. Speculation was driving rent way up. People having problems affording housing. And you know, I wanted to do something about housing, and I said, okay, well, we'll pass a bond issue, we'll put some money into housing, and that's to build some lower income housing. And somebody said, no, there's a better idea that's out there. Guy in the, actually the first citizen, anyone remember the Citizens Party? It was the first Citizens Party guy ever elected in America. Was a member of the city council. His name was Terry Breach. He said, look at the concept of community land trust. And we did. And many of you are familiar with the land trust concept, and what it is the land trust owns the land, you own the house. And you cannot sell that house at market value. So you live in the house for 10 years, and the value of the house goes up by 50%. You can't raise it by 50%. You agree to only raise it at a minimum level. And that keeps that housing affordable, what we call perpetually affordable. So the goal was not to build simple housing, but it was how do you build affordable housing and keep it perpetual. And that land trust idea worked very well in Burlington, spread around the state of Vermont. It's now a national model. Actually, it's an international model. So we can maybe talk about that, but that is one approach that you keep housing affordable. When I was in the House, way back when, I worked with your Congresswoman from California, Barbara Lee, and we passed a legislation, I think it was called the National Affordable Housing Act or something like that, which is not well funded. There's only about $700 million in it now, but it is an opportunity to start getting money around the country, and we've got to do a lot more with that. Lastly, from my perspective, I worked with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and these guys on a Green New Deal for public housing. And sometimes we forget about the importance of public housing. We forget about things like the Faircloth Amendment. Anyone know what that is? I got to tell you, I plead ignorance. I didn't know it until recently. It's this terrible amendment passed in the 90s, which basically limits the amount of public housing that a community can build. Pretty crazy, and we have to repeal that. But the Green New Deal for housing does a couple of good things. Obviously, it is environmentally conscious. It cuts back the kind of carbon emissions in public housing. It saves people money on their fuel bills, which is a big deal. It rehabs many public housing units. Authorities in this country have not had the money to rehabilitate housing, and it's really has deteriorated over the years. I remember being in New York City, one of these mammoth housing projects. The elevator was broken, elderly people couldn't get up or down, et cetera, et cetera. And what it does also is put money to make sure that the people who do the work are often the young people who live in the public housing. They get the training they need in construction skills. So it creates good jobs, it cuts back on emissions, and most importantly, it builds new public housing and rehabilitates old housing. So that's some of what we've done. Last point that I want to make before I give it over to Pramila and Roe is, we work, and you ought to be very nice to us because we work in Washington, D.C. So don't be mean to anybody here. We suffer enough as it is. And just put housing into a broader context. We should not say, gee, everything is going well in America, just damn it, we have a housing problem. We forgot about dealing with housing. We got the healthcare solved, climate is under control. We have a very democratic and vibrant society. Child care is going well. Healthcare, no problem. Go to the doctor of your choice, no money. All these things, but we forgot about housing. That's obviously not the reality. The reality is that in many ways, and what is my concern, and I don't think we talk about it too much, is we are moving toward an oligarchic form of society. And that means not only do we have massive levels of income and wealth inequality, and it's growing worse every day, it's these guys on the top have enormous political power. And they use that political power through their super PACs and their lobbying efforts. So essentially you have both political parties. I mean, obviously the Democrats are not as big as the Republicans, in my view, but who are beholden to corporate interests and big money interests. And that speaks to the need for public financing of elections and so forth, and doing away with Citizens United. But it also speaks not just to the need, and I think earlier Michael Weinstein and others were quite right in saying housing has not been at the level it should be on the progressive agenda. That's true. But on the other hand, what it really speaks to is the absolute need to transform our national priorities. And I don't mean to be rhetorical here, but I'm saying what most of you I think appreciate is you really have a government today that responds to and meets the needs of the very wealthy and large corporations and largely ignores the needs of working people, and low-income people are completely invisible. So, the pharmaceutical industry has 1,800 well-paid lobbyists. Homeless people, to my mind, don't have a whole lot of lobbyists in Washington. They're not making major campaign contributions to campaigns. And where money goes is where politicians pay attention. That's all. So it's a corrupt system, pays attention to the rich and the powerful, ignores the needs of the weak and the vulnerable, and that's where we are today. So all I would ask is that as we change national priorities and as we recognize that we have not paid enough attention to housing, understand that in many ways it's the same thing with healthcare. Some 60,000 people die every single year because they can't get to a doctor on time, can't afford prescription drugs. It's the same thing with the economy where 60% of our people are living paycheck to paycheck, et cetera, et cetera. All of which tells me, in my view, that we do need a political revolution, transforms our national priorities, and does what we can do. This is the richest country on earth. We're not a poor country. Can we build affordable housing that we need? Can we protect tenants? The answer is, well, of course we can. But it will require a massive grassroots effort to transform our political system to do that. And with that, let me give the mic over to Pramila Jayapal.
Thank you. We were talking earlier just before the panel about why is it that housing has not been at the top of every agenda. And I mentioned that during Build Back Better, the way we worked in the House is we...
Explain Build Back Better, not everybody necessarily.
Build Back Better, as you may know, was it was the president's agenda. Initially, it included everything that was part of the president's agenda. It was the infrastructure investments that we were making. It was the investments into water pipes, and it was the investments into childcare, housing, and paid for by taxing the wealthiest, beginning to make the wealthiest and corporations pay their fair share. It was an enormous investment in our country's infrastructure taken broadly. So what is it that families need to thrive? Also had prescription drug pricing in there, Medicare negotiating prescription drug prices for the first time. We really packed a lot into that agenda, and Bernie was the chair of the Budget Committee and put together a budget that was, initially it was actually $6 trillion, I think, dollars that would be invested. It got cut back further and further, but it was still a substantial investment. And we knew that one of the things we would have to do is figure out what were the investments we were going to prioritize. So before this was all put together, I polled our caucus, 103 members in the House, progressive members in the House, and said, here are all the things that we could work on, prioritize. And actually, housing got the most votes of anything. And that was surprising to me, actually, because we had been working on universal health care, on college for all, free four-year public college and two-year trade schools. We had been working on so many things, but housing had been a little bit further behind. Now, we had Maxine Waters, who is the ranking member, previous chair of the Financial Services Committee, where housing is a part of it. And she had been pushing for big housing investments for a long time and was a real leader on this issue. So it's not that there was no work going on. It's just that in the narrative of what was critical for people to thrive, housing didn't always end up at the top of the list. And so I was thinking about why that is, and I'm very proud that because of that vote, we put housing at the top of our list. And we had a meeting, I remember, with the president, and he had a meeting with the different caucuses. So he had brought in the New Democrats, which is, if you think about the House Democratic Caucus, there's the Progressive Caucus, and we are, of course, the best and the first to the most just idea. Then sort of in the spectrum, in the middle, there's what are called the New Democrats, and they tend to be very business friendly. I think they've moved a lot on kind of what we might think of as more social issues, so LGBTQ issues, things like that. They've moved further to the left on, but in terms of business friendly, that's kind of their signature. And then there's the blue dogs, or the problem solvers, who I call them the problem makers caucus, but they're the most conservative of the Democratic caucus. So we're a big tent, we have to figure out how to work all together. But they had come in before, and the president said, here are the things that they've mentioned, and housing was not on the list. But in our meeting, I want you to know that several of us raised housing as a top issue. And I remember the president saying, okay, that wasn't on the other list, but yes, I see why this is important. And so it was very much a priority. So why is it that it hasn't been as forefronted in the narrative? I think it's because for a long time, we've seen housing as something that you address through wages. So in other words, if your wages are good and if they can keep up, then you should be able to afford a house and you shouldn't pay more than 15%, or now we say 20%, but now it's more like 30 to 50% of your income. And so it was seen as something that you are able to do. If you're earning a good wage, you should be able to have a decent place to live. And if you're in public housing, it was a much smaller investment in what the government took care of as far as public investment, and much older. You heard about the Faircloth Amendment, but if you look at our investments in public housing, they've been pretty dismal. I mean, we might have invested in the original building of public housing, but not in the maintenance and the upkeep of public housing. And when my former county executive, Ron Sims, was the deputy secretary at HUD, he started to look at how do you use housing as a central place where you can also deliver a whole bunch of other services, right? So he had a model that he tested in public housing for the first time, where you could start to deliver healthcare, education, other kinds of services there as well. And that was very successful. But I don't think that housing was really seen as a place where the big corporate interests were engaging in the same way that like private insurance companies are with healthcare. Or you look at some of the other ways in which you have a clear villain and you have a clear person, entity that's really driving an expense and a profiteering off of housing. And I think that over the last, say, 10 to 15 years, I'd have to look at the numbers to figure it out, but over the last 10 to 15 years, what you've seen is several things. One, wages have not gone up, absolutely stagnant, and we all have been working on that. And so that's a huge thing. The second thing is that the private sector has entered the housing market in a massive way, and that is absolutely the case with private equity. It is absolutely the case with rentals. I mentioned last night that I had sent a letter to the DOJ along with many of my colleagues saying that we have companies that are developing algorithms that price fix rental rates. And what that means in a place like Seattle is we have a housing crisis, we don't have enough units, and a landlord, let's say a landlord has 10 units, and it used to be the case that you would have to rent out all of those units because you can't afford to take a loss on a unit being vacant. Well, if you fix the price high enough, you can now just rent 3 units and you can leave 7 empty because you're getting so much money. And so that's what we're starting to see in Seattle is a lot of empty units because the prices have been driven up so much. So the DOJ has now just announced in response to our letter that they're doing a investigation into one of the biggest price fixers. So you're seeing the private sector come in and really, once again, profiteer and gouge on both housing prices for sales, but also on rental units. And then I think the last thing is the intersectionality of what it means to thrive. Because if you think about it, all of these things are deeply connected. Last night I was talking to Mayor Bass, and she said that one of the things she was noticing, because she was in the healthcare field before a lot of this work, is that people, when they get moved from the streets into housing, they're not necessarily getting a full health screening, right? And a lot of people are sick because they don't have access to health care. They probably are the uninsured. They probably do not have the ability to get regular checkups. And it's hard to tell whether it's the chicken or the egg. Like, how did somebody become houseless? What are all the factors that went into it? And so I think it becomes difficult to separate these out, but I feel positive about the fact that we are at a place now where housing has made it, and I want to thank all of you and the movement that has helped make that happen, that we are at a place now where we see the crisis of housing in this country. And we see all of the factors that are part and parcel of what it means when you don't have a place to live. That it actually is the central stabilizing force. How do you apply for a job if you don't have an address? How do you get your health insurance if you don't have a stable place? How do you deal with kids if you're houseless? And so I think those are all pieces that you've been a big part of making to happen. And I think the good news is housing is at the top of our agenda now. And we will get a significant investment.
Thanks, Pramila. Roll call.
As someone who represents Silicon Valley, what strikes me the most on housing is just the incredible disparity. I mean, every time I hear Senator Sanders speak about we're the wealthiest country in the world, I'm reminded of my own district, and Alex knows this. I mean, my district has $10 trillion of wealth in my district, Apple, Google, NVIDIA. And you come to my district and they're going to tell you they're going to produce an enormous amount of wealth in the next decade. And you look at other countries, Amartya Sen, this great economist, wrote about how most other developing countries, there's a huge trade-off between economic growth, economic development. In our country, actually, there is not that trade-off. We have the wealth. I've always wondered how it's a hard vote for other people at 434 districts to tax billionaires when the guy who has all the billionaires is saying tax them. I mean, I don't get how it's a hard vote for anyone else. It's like, how many billionaires are in your district? But the point is that this is a issue that shocks the conscience because of that wealth generation that we have. And our problem over the last few decades has gotten worse. I mean, we've gone from, we used to be about 50th in income inequality. We're now 128th as a nation. We're very critical, and appropriately so, of China's Communist Party, but they're 77th. European countries are in the 30s. And you have a situation where there's so many people who basically don't have the basic rights that FDR called for a decent home, or Dr. King said for a decent home. Dr. King actually came close to my district at Stanford in a speech that's worth reading on economic justice. And one of the things he said there was that the right to vote is hard to get, but harder to get than the right to vote is the right to sanitary, decent housing. In our Senate, both are hard to get these days, but the right to vote, at least you had all the Democrats on board. I mean, some of them weren't on board to reverse the filibuster,
Yeah.
but which is a problem. But you can't even, for the economic justice arguments, you can't even get all of the Democrats on board. The senator would know more, but sometimes I don't think it's just two. It's a sort of rotational group that isn't willing to fight on these economic justice issues. Now, I realize that not in a way of hardship. I grew up middle class, and I don't want to exaggerate in any way my hardships, but when I was in my 30s, I had student loans. I get this amazing job. I was renting an apartment, $2,000 a month in Fremont, and I get this amazing chance to work for President Obama. So I said, okay, great, I'm going to go to Washington, D.C. A month after I got there, I get a call from a lawyer. And the lawyer says, you had a one-year lease on your apartment, and I was paying $2,000 in D.C., and you've got to pay off the remaining 5 months of your lease at $2,000 each. And if you don't do that, you're going to get something on your record that will never allow you to rent a home again, or rent an apartment again. I thought the audacity of this guy, he's talking to a young guy in the Obama administration. Imagine, and I was fine. I was able to do it. I had a little debt, but I have good degrees, and I knew I was going to be fine. But imagine the vulnerability of someone who doesn't have those chances, who is not on a salary. And you can think of a lot of reasons why people may have to move. Maybe not to go work for a government, but move because they have family obligations, move because they get displaced from a job. And then they have a lease, or they have an inability to make double rent, which is basically what you have to do. And they get a record, and they get evicted, and they are unable to rent again. The rental market is about power in this country, about the power of landlords versus those who are renting. And so much of the efforts with Build Back Better that Pramila led and that we're trying to do in terms of the laws of rental and tenants' rights, that Cori Bush has a housing tenants' rights proposal, it's all about making sure that that power differential is addressed. That's all that rental regulations are about, that tenant eviction regulations are about. That when you have rental units. You shouldn't have landlords making excessive profits. You shouldn't have them having excessive power to destroy people's lives not being in housing. And you shouldn't have private equity buy up a lot of these properties, not just because they're pricing people out of single-family homes, but also there's no sense of obligation to a community. At least if you're a local landlord, local person in a community, you're accountable to your city council, you're accountable to reputation. You're sitting in Wall Street pulling the strings of what a rental property is. You could care less if someone has hardship and can't make rent, or if the situation isn't improving. And it's simply about the bottom line. And that, unfortunately, as Pramila mentioned, we're having Wall Street take over more and more of the housing in this country in a way that's further aggravating the divide. So I would just end, I guess, in a point that Pramila is right, that housing has become front and center, and of course, the senator emphasized this throughout his campaigns. But my question is, how do we get a broader economic justice and fairness agenda to be more front and center of the Democratic Party and people's goals? Because when you take those on, you take on fights. You have people who like you and people who oppose you. And I think it can't be understated how much people are unwilling to engage in those fights when you've got powerful interests on the other side. But we've got to do a better job of centering the economic justice agenda, of which housing is one part.
Well, I think we have, what do we have, 10 minutes left, or anyone?
Until we have 10 minutes.
Okay, well, I want to open it up, and I'd like to open it up with Rose's question, and I wrote a book kind of on that subject, but it's the future of the Democratic Party in a sense, and who do they represent? When I was a kid, if you walked the street, no matter what your political view would be, you'd say, all right, which party in America represents the working class? Which party represents the bankers and the wealthy people? And everybody knows the Democratic Party represents working people, and the rich with the Republican Party. It's not the case today. Why is that? How do we change it? I think Roe asked the right question. It'll be a bloody internal civil war. And that's in a sense what our presidential candidate campaign was about, is who will control the Democratic Party? What will the priorities of America be? Can we stay on that subject for a moment, because it touches directly to housing? Unless we deal with that issue, change national priorities, including housing, we're not going to be significantly successful. Thoughts on that? Don't be shy. All right, got a hand back there.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the great divide in the country in terms of the working class, and you really pull back the lens, right, Bernie? And you see divide and conquer. You have the working class split. There's a great divide along racial lines, but also rural and small town America. And I think that if you look at the economic hardships in rural and small town America, we as progressives have great solutions to those problems, but we're not reaching them with those messages. So I think, again, getting out a progressive message specifically to rural and small town America, I mean, we have a 5% shift in this electric anyway.
Sure.
We're sweeping the country. Yeah.
Right, good. Michael, do you want to jump in? Yeah.
I have a short-term solution. I think that we have to make contributions from big real estate and the drug companies as toxic as tobacco. I think that we have to the amount of money that the real estate interests spend in California is just astronomical. It is the biggest industry, let's be clear, in the world. Real estate is the biggest industry in the world. And we have people who are, waving the flag of being progressives who are taking boatloads of that money, right? I mean, we succeeded with tobacco and to a degree with big oil, right? Every candidate knew that if they took that money, they're still taking PAC money, but if they took these specific amounts of money from these entities, that they were going to lose votes and they were going to not get endorsements. So I think that's
So you're talking about tying in the real estate industry with the housing crisis and taking money from the real estate industry as a vote maintain homelessness, et cetera.
Yeah.
Good, okay. Other questions or comments? I see a hand right here.
Where am I going?
Right here.
Maybe not from a national perspective, from a statewide perspective. We had the governor that joined us. So I've been involved in the community land trust movement here for quite a long time. We're also on the fight to try to reacquire properties that Caltrans has in the state of California. So right now there's approximately about 2,600 homes boarded up that is owned by the state, managed by Caltrans. But our governor has not done anything about it. And these homes are being sold market rate, right? And these people have been living them. The ones that are, there are actual people that are living, not the 2,600, those are boarded up. That could be turned over to the city and turned over to community land trust for social housing that's being proposed. But we need to start holding these politicians accountable, right? And you talk about this political revolution. That is part of that political revolution, right? And we need to empower, but very few people vote in this country. In my family alone, we've been here since 1926. My great-grandfather arrived here. We're like 700 people on just my mom's side of the family. And I will tell you that maybe 10% of my family extended vote.
Yeah, well, that's,
And for presidential, right? My dad voted for you, Bernie, by the way. He's like, who's that crazy Jewish guy saying things? He reminds me about you. And I'm like, oh, it's Bernie Sanders. But the thing is that we need to hold these politicians accountable because they sound progressive, but then, you know, they're tied to receiving money from real estate and developers and whatnot, right?
Okay.
And that's part of the problem. And I'm seeing more from a statewide level, right? And we really need to have other people here in the city of LA and city council. We started seeing the change with more progressive people taking those seats, right? Isabel Jurado didn't give a chance and she kicked everybody's ass, right? And so she's running in a runoff, right, with Kevin De Leon. But yeah, that's on the local basis here. So we really need to hold accountable and start getting more people there who could represent the interests of the working class. Thank you.
okay, a couple of more questions.
I just wanted to comment, you know, as Representative Jayapal talked about, you have the spectrum of Democrats in the legislature. So I serve in the state legislature. We have the same divide. We have the progressives, the moderates, and then we have the problem makers too, who caucus with the Republicans. Even though there's only 10 Republicans basically left in the state, full office, they try to caucus with them.
That sounds very nice.
Well, I mean, now it's all Dem on Dem fight. You know, like all what we have is even more frustrating.
Yeah.
That we think we should have a common ground, but we don't. We talk about as a party here is that housing is a human right, climate change is important, yet we delay a lot of solutions even when it comes to fossil fuel, and when it comes to housing, and even when it comes to criminalizing homelessness. There are still Democrats that do that. And I do believe in Michael's point about making money toxic. I'm only one of 2 legislators in the entire state legislature that doesn't take any corporate money whatsoever. So 2 out of 120. And it's incredibly difficult, right? I've also offered legislation to ban corporate money in politics, to go to public financing, and that stuff is just pulling teeth to even do so. And my point on that is because Bernie is right, where the money flows, the politicians follow, and it's even the people with the best hearts. I'm sure you serve a lot of colleagues with good hearts. They're just so pragmatically minded that they just have to follow out of fear of their own office, and I have a lot of those folks, right? So if we are successful in reorientating our party, I mean, our party here successfully got rid of tobacco money and I think some oil money out of the party itself, but we haven't done that for the Democrats as a whole, and we need to be much more cognizant about that and making that into a reality. If something that helps in the federal level that's helped us is we actually had really increased disclosure laws. So in Congress, we run for things that transparency is so terrible, it just says paid for by Americans for Children PAC or something like that. We have to list the top 3 funders of all the PACs in really bright lettering. So it says Lyft, realtors, all these people, right? So that disclosure has really helped us win a lot more seats too, and also expose a lot of that money. And then, of course, the IEs now have tried to wiggle their way around it. But I think having more disclosure, which we have fought for a long time, has been really, really helpful in doing that. And if federally, that's something I feel like
working on
people
that.
across the spectrum would want more transparency
Yeah.
and politicians and money, right, hopefully, so that would be helpful. But my other point is just hoping that, Bernie, you're working with a bunch of Congress members on the Green New Deal for public housing, is, as I talked about in my talk earlier, this key reason that the Conservative Party in Singapore or the Socialist Party in Vienna were able to take power and stay in power for almost 100 years is that root delivery of housing, like the ability to deliver housing, and without a robust social public housing sector developer in play in the sector to provide housing for people, people are going to feel very, as you talked about last night, disillusioned with democracy.
that's right.
And so I'm hoping that, as Representative Tlaib has a public sector developer for the 21st century bill too, if that could be incorporated in the platform, I think that could galvanize a lot, because there's a lot more people across the country right now, different states, who are turning to social housing as an alternative to provide housing too.
I was, as you talked about transparency, literally, when I first got into the Senate, I was thinking of introducing legislation. NASCAR drivers, they have their stuff, they have all the companies that sponsor them. We can have senators say, hey, I'm sponsored by the oil companies, the fossil fuel industry. I thought that would put it on right on your jacket. And then when you vote, people will get the...
Oh my God, I love that. I love that. I wanted to say, just on the taking
say it
corporate
briefly,
PAC
or something.
money,
We gotta get out of here in a
just
minute.
taking corporate PAC money, you said there's 2 now. When I first ran, there were 4 of us that didn't take corporate PAC money. Now there's 70. So it is possible to make it toxic. It's not enough because the money still flows in. But don't give up hope on that, because I do think, and maybe this should be the new uniform of the Sanders Institute, is, you have people and you can only enter the doors if you say who you're sponsored by, and of course all of us would say the people.
Bernie, one line, which is, I think there's a divide, a blunt divide in how the Democratic Party looks at this election. On the one hand, you have people saying, let's make it about democracy preservation, let's make it about the standing up for norms, all of which the other side would agree with, but I think on the other side they'd say you can't have democracy and a thriving democracy if you don't deal with the structural inequalities in the system and the frustrations that people feel.
All right, on that note, all right, let me thank all of you. I know on behalf of Rowan Pramila, thank you so much for the work you're doing. Let's go forward together. Thank you.
Thank you.